Since the release of Borderlands 2 back in 2012, the gaming landscape has changed in numerous ways, and one of those ways has been in the increase in popularity of loot-based shooters, and leading on from that, games as a service. A model whereby games receive content drops over time, which of course will be almost entirely based around the popularity of that game with the community. We've had 2 Destiny games since Borderlands 2, and we've had 2 Division games as well. Even with their stumbles and weaknesses, they have stood the test of time. But then we also have Anthem, which looks like it's heading towards an early death. With content plans scrapped and a player base on life support, we have another entrant to the looter shooter genre now. The 3rd game in the long-running series, and it's Borderlands 3. Players have waited years for this game as they anticipate getting their hands on the ridiculous amount of weapons contained within, but can it possibly live up to the expectations? Can it surpass the excellent Borderlands 2? Without delivering a paradigm shift for the series, Gearbox and 2K have delivered an excellent game jam-packed with missions and content for solo and co-op gamers. After a handful of hours with the game, I thought it was exceptional, but the more and more I played, cracks did begin to appear. With its excellent gameplay and shooting mechanics, it is only let down by some poor performance issues across all systems, a lackluster story, and some irritating characters. If you're a Borderlands fan, then this game is a must-buy. Just know that I can see fans divided on whether it's actually a stronger game than Borderlands 2. But for everyone, we head back to Pandora before leaving it behind in the largest Borderlands game yet. So it seems like each game released these days has at least some problems upon launch, and Borderlands 3 is no exception. The title is plagued by performance issues, no matter which platform you decide to play it on, and that goes for both solo and co-op play, with the latter having some real issues, and I'd say there would be many players who give up on the mode until a solution is pushed out with an update, if it ever gets better. Having played most of the game solo, performance issues crop up from the very start, and in my experience, these became worse the longer I played the game. The main offender would be the very inconsistent frame rate throughout the entire playtime. Playing on the Xbox One X, players are offered to run the game in either a resolution or performance mode, but just be warned that the performance mode is nowhere near a consistent and solid 60 frames a second. If anything, the game would rarely hit that peak at all outside of simple indoor areas with minimal effects on screen. But it isn't just the frame rate either, as it seems that frame pacing is also an issue, and both contribute to constant micro stutters a lot of the time. Depending on your susceptibility when it comes to frame rate issues will determine just how much of an issue it is for you when playing Borderlands 3. Almost my entire playtime was played in the performance mode, and the footage you're watching is captured in that mode, but I did switch over and play in the resolution mode too, but at least in my experience, I preferred the performance mode even with its issues. Choosing resolution gave the frame rate a little more consistency, with it maxing out around the 30 frames per second mark, but the game still had regular performance problems. I found the game controlled and felt better to me when using performance mode, but as I said, this will differ based upon the player, so definitely give both a go and stick with the one you find better for your playstyle. But the technical issues didn't end there. The game has a tendency to have slight freezes during gameplay or persistent stutters outside of simple frame rate problems. This happened a few times in the first half of the game, but I discovered that the longer I played, the more frequent these would become and more annoying as well. Being in the middle of a firefight only for the screen to completely freeze for a couple of seconds is disconcerting, and I also had a couple of times where the freezing went for a lot longer. At these times, I almost quit out of the game to restart, but then it would go back to normal somewhat. These problems also happened in split-screen play, but seeing as I played the game much more in solo mode, I didn't have as many issues with it, but it still did occur. On another note, I was hoping for the 3rd installment of Borderlands that each area would truly become open world, but instead, players are still presented with load screens between areas, which breaks up the experience. It isn't a huge complaint, but I would have liked to see load screens minimized to only visiting other planets. Now, moving on from the performance and focusing on the visuals themselves, Borderlands 3 has taken a step up from its predecessor, which is to be expected considering the games are 7 years apart. But still, Borderlands 3 impresses in the areas it needs to without being drop-dead gorgeous. Of course, there are no super realistic textures or facial animations, and that isn't what Borderlands is about. In its place is more of that Borderlands look that fans have come to know and love. It's just given a shiny new coat of paint. There are some low quality textures around, and overall it would have been better if the game had some higher detail in this regard, but with the performance issues already, I'll take these textures. Each of the planets you visit have sprawling, large maps, and each offers great detail, whether that be in the form of city skylines or more jungle-like areas with dense foliage. Draw distances are pretty good at all times, even if these areas do take a toll on the game's performance, especially when battling enemies. Perhaps the two areas where the visuals are their best is in the lighting and weapon models. The lighting looks a lot more intricate and impressive when compared to Borderlands 2, and each planet uses it in different ways. Whether it's more subtle like on Eden 6, or whether the whole landscape is blanketed in a sort of glow like from the harsh sun of Pandora. The lighting extends to weapons fire and the weapons themselves, where some can glow and pulsate with different effects, which gives each their own character. When in a firefight, the lighting from explosions and weapons fire all look great within that classic Borderlands aesthetic. The series has never looked or even sounded better. Music is very subdued for the most part while simply walking around the different areas, and then of course it kicks in more when engaged with enemies, and special mention must go towards the boss fights where the music really gets intense. It isn't the type of music where I would listen to the soundtrack or anything like that, but in the context of the game it fits in with what Borderlands is all about. Killing a huge amount of enemies and big bosses with a huge amount of guns, and those weapons do sound unique, and considering the gigantic number of weapons in the game, the developers have done well to try and differentiate between the weapons through sound as much as they can. And be sure to check out the link in the description where the sound designers for the game go into detail about how they went about creating what you hear whilst you play the game. So let's talk about what it's actually like to play Borderlands 3, the gameplay, the gunplay, the shooting mechanics. When it comes to these, Borderlands 3 excels, and as it just plays as a better version of the previous games. The shooting and movement feel tighter and more responsive, and with the additions made to the movement, the game is just a whole lot of fun to play. For this third outing, players are now able to slide along the ground, which isn't something new in gaming, as many other titles have the feature, but it's a welcome addition to Borderlands. Sprinting towards enemies, sliding and shooting at them, all the while their bullets are just flying over your head, it just never gets old and it feels fantastic. Or firing at enemies as you slide in behind cover to shield yourself as you reload. It all feels solid, and you always feel in control, which is important when you have access to 4 different weapons, grenades, and character abilities as well. Players can also now grapple onto ledges, which makes moving and jumping around just that much better instead of slightly missing a ledge or it being out of reach. These are small additions to the game, but they add so much to it and just make it all more enjoyable. But whereas Borderlands 3 has improved upon Borderlands 2 with its gameplay, it's most definitely gone backwards when it comes to its story, characters, and a lot of the writing. It's as if they've taken what made those things interesting in Borderlands 2 and just threw them off a cliff and just left us with the remains. It only took a few hours of playtime to sense that something wasn't right when it came to the writing. This is apart from the fact that the previous game is 7 years old, with a style and sense of humour that could be hit or miss, but it was mostly a hit. It had the fantastic villain with Handsome Jack, and the side characters were interesting and added additional depth when the story played out. Handsome Jack was this charismatic, witty, egotistical, and almost tyrannical leader of the Hyperion Corporation. He was this villain you loved to hate. He was evil, but you couldn't help but like his character in the game, as he was superbly written and voice acted, and was one of the greatest parts of Borderlands 2. Conversely, it's almost painful to say that almost none of that charm has been taken across when it comes to the main villains in Borderlands 3. The Calypso twins just don't compare to Handsome Jack. Modelling them after YouTube or Twitch streamers isn't a bad idea, as streaming has become so popular since the second game released, but they just come across as annoying most of the time, and well, not that funny. The great cast of characters from Borderlands 2 are underutilised to make up for the lackluster villains. Characters such as Claptrap, Hammerlock, Tiny Tina, Moxie, Ellie, and so on. Claptrap is severely underused and was such a good part of earlier games. Lilith returns and has a recurring role to keep the story going, but it doesn't stand out as something that's a positive or negative. She's just there. All of the dialogue is delivered well in the game, but a lot of the humour fell flat for me, and because these problems existed, especially with the main villains, I just found myself starting to zone out of the story. I never tried to skip the cutscenes at all, but I wasn't invested in what was happening as I was with Borderlands 2, and because of this, I started to grow tired of actually going through the story. The longer I played, it almost felt like it was getting in the way of me shooting and killing enemies, because that side of the game is so damn fantastic. The planet of Pandora makes a return and is the starting planet for the game, but it was a great addition for Gearbox to expand on previous Borderlands games and allow players to visit other planets as part of the story. Considering we've been on Pandora so much already, the other locations freshen up the game and was a much needed change for the series, especially since the other locations are just as vast and just as interesting. The town of Sanctuary from the second game makes a return in Borderlands 3, but this time around, it's the name of your ship which will take you to these different planets, whilst vehicles also make a return to help you get around when you're on those planets. How much enjoyment you'll get out of the game will also come down to what Borderlands actually is as a franchise. Players have a choice of 4 different characters, each with their own abilities, and you're free to invest points into those areas you want to focus your build more on. You will earn experience by completing missions, killing enemies and bosses, like most similar games, but how much fun you will have will come down to whether you like the core gameplay loop of defeating enemies in different areas with different weapons. Constantly moving forward to find better weapons and making your way to the next boss. And this was another area which I'd hope would have been better. There were some interesting bosses, but I wanted some different mechanics to go along with them. Often it was just a big boss with lots of firepower, with normal enemies thrown in to artificially increase the difficulty. I would have liked to see more differences between each of them, or throw in some environmental elements that can help the player or create another obstacle for them. One boss battle saw them create swirling vortexes of frost or cover the floor in ice, which would damage the player if you got too close. And this was great, but then the same enemies I've been fighting the whole game are still in this boss fight as well. Another issue I had, but thankfully only once, was that one boss fight did bug out on me. He would teleport around the room until he was almost dead. Then he teleported into a wall, became nothing but a ball of light, and I could no longer fight. This needed a restart and to do the fight once again. In terms of the difficulty, solo players will find some challenge, but overall, the game isn't that hard provided you've properly leveled, and if not, just do some side missions and come back to the area or encounter later. Surprisingly, the game only has an easy and normal mode, so those looking for more challenge during their initial playthrough will be disappointed, as the game could use a hard mode, especially for those playing co-op. Those after more difficulty will need to wait until they finish the game and unlock the Mayhem mode as they enter the endgame. Now, in my experience, how good an endgame is in a looter shooter is rarely known until weeks and especially months after release. Borderlands 3 is a great game, with the best gameplay the series has seen, and if you're a Borderlands fan and you'll be playing this mostly cooperatively, then the game is highly recommended for some over-the-top fun. It's unfortunate that even with the stellar gameplay, the total package is let down by its mediocre story and characters and its technical issues. If you're after more Borderlands action, then this plays like a better version of what you've played before. If you are after the total package, then you very well may feel that Borderlands 2 is still the high point of the series.